When the final Dutch ship was permitted to anchor at Dejima in 1641, Japan didn't just close its borders. It engineered one of history's most deliberate experiments in controlled isolation, a two-century period that would fundamentally reshape every aspect of Japanese society, from the architecture of its cities to the psychology of its people. This wasn't a simple lockdown. It was the construction of an entire civilization designed to function as a closed system. And understanding how it worked requires examining not just the policies of the Tokugawa shogunate, but the intricate machinery of daily survival that kept 20 million people alive on an island chain with no external trade, no foreign technology, and no escape valve for internal pressures. The morning in Edo began not with sunlight, but with the sound of wooden clappers echoing through neighborhoods as night watchmen signaled the end of their shifts. By the time the sky turned from black to gray, the city was already in motion, and this motion was itself a marvel of logistical choreography. Edo had become the largest city on Earth by the early 18th century, with a population exceeding 1 million, and it had achieved this density without any of the resources that typically sustained urban centers of such magnitude. There were no foreign grain imports to buffer failed harvests. There were no international trade networks to redistribute goods during regional shortages. Every calorie consumed in Edo had to be grown, transported, and distributed through a domestic supply chain that operated with the precision of a mechanical clock. And the rice economy was the foundation of this closed world, but calling it simply an economy understates its total penetration into every aspect of existence. Rice wasn't just food or currency, it was the measuring stick for social status, the basis of taxation, the medium of payment for samurai stipends, and the primary mechanism through which the shogunate maintained control over the daimyo lords. A samurai of middling rank might receive an annual stipend of 50 koku, a measurement representing the amount of rice needed to feed one person for 1 year. This stipend didn't arrive as bags of grain. It materialized as a complex transaction involving merchant intermediaries, warehouse receipts, and exchange rates that fluctuated with harvest quality and regional supply. The samurai would take his warehouse receipt to a designated merchant, who would convert a portion to actual rice for household consumption and the remainder to silver coins for other purchases. This process repeated itself thousands of times daily across Edo, creating a financial ecosystem of staggering complexity, operating entirely without foreign exchange or external capital. The physical infrastructure supporting this system was equally remarkable. The great Kura storehouses that lined the Sumida River weren't merely buildings. They were fortifications against famine, engineered with the same attention to structural integrity as castle keeps. Their walls combined thick layers of clay and plaster designed to regulate temperature and humidity, protecting stored rice from rot and insect infestation. Inside, the rice wasn't simply piled in heaps, it was stored in carefully stacked rice bales, and each weighing approximately 60 kilograms and marked with stamps indicating its origin, quality grade, and ownership. Merchants employed specialized workers whose sole job was monitoring these storehouses, checking for signs of moisture penetration, rodent intrusion, or fermentation. The failure of a single storehouse could ripple through the entire urban food supply within days. But the morning activities in Edo extended far beyond the management of rice reserves. As the sun rose, the vegetable vendors began their migrations from the suburban farming villages into the urban core. These weren't casual street merchants. They were components of an elaborate distribution network, organized by guild membership and operating under licenses issued by the city magistrates. A vegetable vendor couldn't simply set up anywhere. At specific street corners and market spaces were assigned based on neighborhood, product type, and vendor ranking within the guild hierarchy. The daikon radish sellers occupied different spaces than the eggplant merchants, and both were segregated from the fish vendors whose goods required proximity to fresh water sources. The fishing industry itself demonstrated the kind of adaptation necessary in a closed system. With international waters effectively forbidden and foreign fishing techniques unavailable, Japanese fishermen developed increasingly sophisticated methods for maximizing yields from coastal waters. The morning fish markets in Edo received deliveries that had departed from coastal villages in the pre-dawn darkness, transported in wooden tanks designed to keep catches alive during the journey. Dead fish fetched lower prices and spoiled rapidly in warm weather, so the engineering of these transport systems became crucial. Some fishermen employed relay systems, transferring catches to fresh water at intermediate stations. Others developed specific netting and handling techniques that minimized injury to the fish, prolonging survival time. The result was a supply chain that delivered live fish to urban markets through entirely domestic innovation. The social hierarchy governing all these activities wasn't an abstract concept. It was enforced through visible daily mechanisms that structured every interaction. A samurai walking through the morning streets moved through a world where physical space itself acknowledged his status. Commoners were required to step aside when samurai passed, but the degree of bowing required varied according to rank, with higher-ranking samurai entitled to deeper and longer bows. But this wasn't merely performative deference. It was backed by the legal right of kirisute gomen, the privilege allowing samurai to cut down commoners who failed to show proper respect. While actual incidents were relatively rare, the existence of this right fundamentally shaped the psychology of public space. Merchants conducting morning business transactions did so with constant awareness of samurai presence and the need to demonstrate appropriate submission. Yet, within this rigid hierarchy existed zones of surprising complexity and negotiation. The great merchant houses of Edo had accumulated wealth that often exceeded that of lower-ranking samurai, creating a tension between formal status and economic power. A wealthy merchant might live in a house technically less grand than what his wealth could afford, deliberately restraining architectural display to avoid offending samurai sensibilities. His clothing would conform to sumptuary laws restricting certain fabrics and colors to specific classes. But inside his home, away from public view, luxury items might include artworks and furnishings that rivaled those of daimyo estates. This dual existence of public modesty and private wealth became a defining characteristic of merchant culture during the Sakoku period. The morning activities of common laborers revealed yet another layer of the closed system's functioning. Edo's population density created constant demand for construction, repair, and maintenance work, but the supply of raw materials operated under severe constraints. Timber for building came from carefully managed forests, many of which had been planted decades earlier specifically to supply urban construction needs. The shogunate had learned from the devastating fires that repeatedly swept through Edo that unrestricted logging created deforestation problems that compounded disaster vulnerability. Forestry became a managed science, with specific mountains designated for timber production and cutting schedules designed to ensure sustainable yields. Carpenters arriving at construction sites in the morning worked with wood that represented the culmination of planning that had begun before they were born. The architectural style that evolved under these constraints had demonstrated sophisticated adaptation to available resources and recurring disasters. The Mahaya townhouses that lined Edo's commercial districts weren't built to last for centuries. They were designed to be rapidly reconstructed after fires, which remained a constant threat in a city where buildings were predominantly wooden and heating relied on charcoal braziers. The construction techniques emphasized modular joinery that could be quickly assembled and disassembled. Carpenters developed standardized measurements for structural elements, allowing components to be pre-cut and stockpiled for rapid deployment after disasters. This wasn't just practical engineering. It represented a philosophical acceptance that in a closed system, vulnerable to recurring catastrophes, resilience came not from building structures that couldn't be destroyed, but from developing the capacity to rebuild quickly when destruction occurred. By mid-morning, the streets filled with vendors offering services that reflected the ecosystem of specialized occupations emerging within the closed economy. Itinerant craftsmen wandered neighborhoods calling out their trades: knife sharpening, pot repair, umbrella mending. These weren't marginal activities, they were essential components of a society where importing replacement goods was impossible and domestic manufacturing couldn't scale to meet every need. A broken ceramic pot couldn't be casually discarded and replaced with an import. It required repair, often involving intricate techniques for drilling holes and binding cracks with metal staples. Umbrellas constructed from bamboo frames and oiled paper demanded regular maintenance to remain functional through Japan's intense rainy seasons. And the vendors who provided these services were preserving not just objects, but the material basis of daily life in a society that had to make existing resources last. The morning also brought the movement of information through the city, though this too operated under strict controls. The shogunate maintained an elaborate censorship apparatus governing printed materials, with publishers required to submit manuscripts for approval before printing. But information still flowed, often through networks that operated in the spaces between official surveillance. The morning gossip exchanged at public baths, at tea houses, and in market spaces constituted an informal communication system that authorities could monitor but never fully control. News of rice prices, of samurai scandals, of government policies, and of conditions in other domains circulated through these channels, creating a parallel information economy that existed alongside official pronouncements. The bathhouses themselves were crucial social institutions that took on enlarged importance in the closed society. Public bathing wasn't merely about hygiene. It was one of the few spaces where rigid class boundaries softened slightly, where merchants and lower-ranking samurai might occupy the same facility, though usually at different times or in subtly segregated sections. The bathhouse conversations, conducted in the relaxed atmosphere of hot water and steam, became venues for business negotiation, social networking, and information exchange. For the urban poor, bathhouses provided basic sanitation services that individual dwellings often lacked. For wealthy merchants, they offered social contact that formal business settings constrained. The bathhouse culture that flourished during Sakoku represented adaptation to the social pressures of a closed society that offered limited venues for horizontal social interaction across class boundaries. The agricultural calendar governed rural life with rhythms that intensified during the closed country period. Farming villages operated under the Muraoka system, where the village as a collective unit bore responsibility for delivering rice tax quotas to the domain authorities. This collective responsibility created both cooperation and tension within villages. Households with more productive land or greater labor capacity carried heavier burdens, but also wielded more influence over village decisions. And the morning work assignments during planting and harvest seasons were determined through village meetings, where elders negotiated labor distribution, attempting to balance equity with efficiency. Failure to meet tax quotas could result in punishment for village headmen, creating intense pressure to maximize yields through whatever means available. The agricultural techniques employed showed the innovation possible within a closed system facing resource constraints. With foreign fertilizers unavailable and commercial fertilizer markets underdeveloped, farmers relied on elaborate composting systems that recycled every possible organic material. Human waste from cities was collected and sold to rural areas as fertilizer, creating a waste management and agricultural supply chain that operated at remarkable scale. The boats that delivered fish to Edo markets returned laden with night soil, purchased from urban collection operations. This closed-loop recycling was essential for maintaining soil fertility under intensive cultivation, but it also created public health challenges that authorities struggled to manage. The midday meal in most households was simple, reflecting both economic constraints and the limited variety available in the closed food system. Rice remained the staple, supplemented by preserved vegetables, small amounts of fish or tofu, and miso soup. The cuisine that developed during Sakoku showed creativity within constraints, with preservation techniques like pickling, drying, and fermenting extending the availability of seasonal products. But dietary variety remained limited compared to societies with access to international trade. Famines, when they occurred, hit with devastating force precisely because there were no external sources of emergency food supplies. The Tenmei famine of the 1780s killed hundreds of thousands, and the memory of such catastrophes shaped food culture throughout the period. Wasting food became not just economically foolish, but culturally transgressive. The practice of eating every grain of rice in one's bowl, of finding uses for vegetable scraps, of preserving every possible calorie became embedded cultural practices shaped by the reality of isolation. The afternoon brought different rhythms to urban and rural areas. In Edo, samurai attended to administrative duties or engaged in martial training, maintaining combat readiness despite the extended peace that characterized much of the Tokugawa period. This created a paradox where a warrior class had to justify its privileged position without wars to fight. The solution was elaborate formalization of martial practice, with schools of swordsmanship, archery, and other combat arts developing philosophical dimensions that extended beyond mere fighting technique. Samurai practiced not just to prepare for battle, but to cultivate spiritual discipline and demonstrate cultural refinement. The afternoon training sessions in domain compounds became performances of status as much as preparations for combat. Merchant houses used afternoon hours for account keeping and business planning. The financial instruments and accounting practices that evolved during Sakoku showed remarkable sophistication despite the absence of international banking connections. Merchants developed credit systems, insurance mechanisms, and complex partnership arrangements that allowed capital formation and risk distribution. The great merchant houses like Mitsui operated networks spanning multiple domains, moving goods and managing finances through branch offices and trusted agents. The account books these merchants maintained were themselves innovations, using specific notation systems and verification procedures that prevented fraud while enabling delegation of authority to distant subordinates. Artisans spent afternoons at work that had often been passed down through generations of family training. The closed system created conditions where craft specialization could deepen, because practitioners weren't competing with foreign imports or displaced by foreign technologies. Where a sword polisher might spend years perfecting techniques for bringing out the subtle patterns in forged steel. A lacquerware artist could devote a career to mastering methods for applying dozens of layers of lacquer with precise timing and environmental control. The objects these artisans produced weren't just consumer goods. They were embodiments of accumulated knowledge that couldn't be easily replicated, and their value reflected not just beauty, but the scarcity created by the closed system's technological isolation. Religious institutions maintained their own rhythms, with temples and shrines continuing to serve as social centers, even as the shogunate's promotion of Neo-Confucian ideology complicated Buddhism's position. The afternoon prayers and rituals at temples drew participants seeking spiritual solace, social connection, and practical benefits. Temples operated schools, provided welfare services, and managed extensive landholdings. The monks who maintained these institutions navigated complex relationships with secular authorities, balancing religious identity with political realities. For many common people, temples remained more immediately relevant than the abstract Confucian principles that dominated official ideology. Evening brought the city's transformation as darkness fell and the night watch took over the streets. Edo's fire prevention system relied on neighborhood watch groups who monitored for signs of fire and maintained readiness to respond to outbreaks. The wooden clappers that sounded at regular intervals through the night served both as time signals and as confirmations that watchmen remained alert. The fear of fire was so pervasive that it shaped urban planning, with fire breaks cut through dense neighborhoods and designated areas where buildings could be quickly demolished to prevent fire spread. Households maintained fire prevention equipment as a legal requirement, with buckets, water barrels, and heavy quilts that could be soaked and used to protect against flames. The evening also brought the entertainment districts to life, spaces where the social rigidities of day softened in controlled ways. The pleasure quarters like Yoshiwara existed in a carefully managed liminal zone where samurai could interact with merchants and artisans, where money rather than status determined access, and where the performances of courtesans and actors offered glimpses of expression not available in more formal settings. These districts operated under tight regulation, with walls and checkpoints controlling access, but within them existed subcultures that developed distinctive aesthetic movements. The ukiyo-e woodblock prints that emerged from these environments captured a floating world that existed in tension with the official culture of samurai discipline and Confucian morality. The night in rural areas brought different concerns. Security against thieves remained important, as agricultural wealth stored in village granaries attracted criminal attention. But the darkness also brought relief from the day's labor and time for family interactions, craft work, and community gatherings. Villages often maintained communal spaces where residents gathered for evening conversations, sharing news and reinforcing social bonds. These informal gatherings were where village consensus formed on important decisions, where disputes were aired and sometimes resolved, and where the collective identity that made the Muraki system function was maintained. As night deepened, the closed world of Sakoku Japan settled into temporary quiet. The isolation that defined the era wasn't simply an absence of foreign contact. It was a positive condition that shaped institutions, behaviors, philosophies, and material culture in distinctive ways. The society that emerged from 2 centuries of closure developed remarkable internal complexity, sophisticated organizational systems, and cultural practices that demonstrated human adaptability to constrained conditions. When Perry's black ships arrived in 1853, they didn't encounter a static or backward civilization. They found a society that had engineered solutions to the unique challenges of prolonged isolation, solutions that would continue to influence Japanese culture and institutions long after the borders reopened. The legacy of Sakoku wasn't simply closure, but the distinctive patterns of organization, the cultural values of self-sufficiency and careful resource management, and the institutional practices that had evolved to make survival possible in a world deliberately separated from the broader currents of global change.